All right, good day. We're starting again on our international lesson. This is Palm Sunday. The lesson doesn't really have anything to do with Palm Sunday. It's still in the Old Testament, and we're talking about prophets. Particularly today, we're talking about the prophet Elijah. Now, last week we had the King Josiah. King Josiah was in the southern kingdom, if you remember Israel. North had Israel split at the time of the son of Solomon, and was split thereafter. Never did become unified again. Josiah was the king in the south. Capital was Jerusalem. Elijah comes to deal with the king in the north. His name is Ahab, and his capital is Samaria. We've heard Samaria, of course, that comes up in the New Testament where Jesus stops at a well and talks to a Samaritan woman in that. Also, Josiah was king of Judah about the year 600. Now, just a few years after that, his son, well, three of his sons were on the throne and deposed, all three of them. But 587, just about 15 years after Josiah, Jerusalem was destroyed. His sons were carried off in captivity. One was taken to Egypt. One was taken to Babylon. I think another, I'm trying to think of what happened to the third one. He was deposed too, or maybe he was just left as a puppet on the throne for a while, but later he was deposed too. Elijah was 250 years before that time, about the time of we would say 850. That would be that time. It'd be like going back in our history to colonial times. It'd be that time. And you think about all the changes that have happened in our country since George Washington was president to our times now. Clothing styles have changed. Transportation has changed. Well, there hadn't been a lot changed back in that time, in those 250 years, except evil. Evil had gotten worse. The kings were worse. Ahab was one of the worst kings. Now, politically, people would look and say, he did good stuff. One of the things he did was he married Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Sidon. Sidon was a country farther to the north. Now, Sidon had been very involved in Solomon when he built the temple. He had brought a man from Sidon, an architect and builder, to build the temple. But Jezebel had married Ahab. Now, take her name, Jezebel. You could change those vowels, and Hebrew, the vowels change often. You could make it Jezebel. Jezebel. Her father's name was Ethbaal. He was a very strong worshiper of Baal. Baal was the male part of their deity there. Asherah was, or Astarte, was the female part of their deity. It was a very pagan type of worship. She brought along 500 priests of Baal and 400 and some of Asherah, so that there was temples built for them and all that. Elijah came along as a prophet to the north, but a prophet of God, a prophet of the Lord. And he spoke to Ahab and he challenged him. Now, one of the big challenges that came was Elijah came to Ahab and proclaimed it in the street. And the word got to Ahab about it. He said, there's going to be a drought. God is going to stop the rain for 3 years. And it's going to be a terrible, terrible, hungering, thirsting time. Because in 3 years, a lot of plant food's going to die. Trees are going to die, as well as the streams are going to dry up. 3 years. At the end of about 3 years, it happens that Ahab has a kind of like Secretary of State, and his name is Obadiah. And he says to Obadiah, we've got to find water and hay for our horses and mules. Didn't say you got to find food for the people. You've got to find it for the horses and mules. Now, what are the horses and the mules significant? That's part of the army. That's the cavalry, you might say, in that. And he's going to lose his horses. He's not going to have a defense. He's got to find hay and he's got to find water for them. So Ahab says to Obadiah, as Secretary of State, he said, you head that direction, I'm going to head this direction. Now it sounds like they're going off by themselves, but that's not the case. A king doesn't walk off by himself. He takes a bunch of bodyguards, his secret service, with him as he goes, and you can bet that Obadiah did the same. Now, Ahab's name is not that significant, but Obadiah's name is a Hebrew name. It's Obed and Yah. Now, Obed is a Hebrew word for servant. There's another word, but Obed is the main word for servant. So, servant of Yah, or servant of the Lord, servant of Yahweh. That's his name. You'd almost think, with a name like that, how did he get to be Secretary of State? Well, we don't know. He just comes on the scene all of a sudden here, and he'll go off the scene too. But in this situation, he's on the scene, and he's been sent with his bodyguard and his company of soldiers to find water and hay in a different part of Israel. Not down in Judah, but in another part of Israel. Anyway, Obadiah is looking with his group, and he sees Elijah coming. Now, he's seen Elijah before, when he came up 3 years ago. And Elijah comes up to Obadiah and he says, Obadiah, I want you to go tell the king that I'm coming to see him. And Obadiah says, oh, don't do that to me. Don't do that to me. Because I'll go to the king and I'll tell him you're coming, and then we'll come down here and you won't be here. Who knows where the Lord will take you? You see, he has a sense of, this is a prophet of the Lord, and he's not to be played with. Now, you could think, Obadiah, why don't you just arrest him and take him with you? But he doesn't. He respects this prophet of the Lord in that. And Elijah says to Obadiah, I'm going to stay. I will not disappear. You go tell Ahab I'm coming to see him. So Obadiah does that. He finds Ahab, and I guess they go back to the palace. I don't know whether they ever found any hay or water for the horses, but he goes back to the palace, and Elijah comes. And he says to Ahab, who calls him the troubler, he says, is that you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah says, I'm not the trouble, you are. You're the trouble here. But he says, God is going to send rain. But before he sends rain, I'm challenging you because you have been a rotten king. And we're going to have a contest to see who's really God. So he says, we go up on Mount Carmel. Now, it's an interesting thing. There's an altar up on Mount Carmel, an altar to God. There's also an altar up there to Baal. So Elijah says, you get the prophets of Baal to fix up your altar. I'll take care of the altar to the real God. And so they get it ready. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but they send up the people and the prophets, and the prophets of Baal put their offering on the altar, and they call on Baal to come and consume it with fire. Nothing happens. Elijah puts his offering on the altar that he's fixed up, and has water poured on it, and then calls on God to come, and comes and does it. And then he takes the prophets down the hill, and he says, we're going to wipe out the prophets of Baal because only God is the prophet. And there's a big slaughter, that's all you can call it, massacre of the prophets of Baal. Well, Jezebel's not happy. And she sends word to Elijah and said, what you did to my prophets, I'm going to do to you. And you know what Elijah did? He ran. He ran, scared. Now, he goes down to Beersheba and that area, and he sits there, and he kind of weeps and carries on, and God protects him. Not going to get into all that detail, but there's some lessons here that I want to pick up on for us. One, question is, why is Obadiah, whose name means servant of the Lord, working in King Ahab's pagan court? Doesn't seem like that's where he ought to be. Seems like he ought to have left that place and gone someplace else. Well, if you read the Bible, there's a number of situations where God has his people, his agents, intermixed with the enemy. Paul writes to the church, and he says, those of Caesar's household greet you. These are people that were working for Caesar. When Jesus calls Matthew to follow him. Matthew's a tax collector. Now, the other disciples didn't think a lot of Matthew, but Jesus never held that up against him. Nor with Zacchaeus either, who was also a tax collector. As a matter of fact, people found fault with Jesus because he hung around them. And he didn't seem to judge them. We can go back to others in that situation. There's the situation of his name just slips me. Let me grab my sheet here. Of Esther. Esther was queen of Babylon. She was part of the harem of Xerxes. You say, well, that's not what a good girl ought to be. But she was there, and her uncle said, perhaps God has placed you here for such a time as this. And it was. She saved her people. There would be other situations of that. Obadiah, as I mentioned, was there. He had hidden 100 prophets of the Lord. 100 of them. Now, when Elijah went down into the desert and he felt despondent and discouraged, he said, Lord, I'm the only one. I'm the only one. And God said, no, you're not. I've got a lot that haven't bowed their knee to Baal. You're not the only one. Including the 100 that Obadiah had hidden in caves and brought food to. So we need to be a little cautious if we judge other people and say, I don't know what they're doing with that group of people. God may be using them for his own purposes in terms of that. A second thing is that God speaks, and he spoke to Obadiah, he spoke to Elijah, he spoke to a lot of people with the same word, fear not. There's a lot of times we can be afraid. Being afraid is not a sin. But God reminds us that he's with us and that we don't have to be afraid. But I don't think I've found any place in the Bible where God got mad at somebody because they were a bit afraid. He wanted to speak a word of compassion and peace to them in terms of that. So we need to be cautious of judging other people. We need to be aware that there are times we are afraid. Remember the psalmist said, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not be afraid. Well, I've been in a few shadow places, and I'm going to tell you, I was afraid. But I remember people saying, but God is with you. And there was a little boy who was sent up to bed by his parents, and he kept coming downstairs. And his parents said, Johnny, you're okay up there in bed. God's with you. And Johnny said, but I want somebody that has a face. You see, we want that somebody to be with us. My children were like that. They wanted me to stay in the room to make sure they were safe. Well, I could be God's proxy at that. Now, if I had snuck off, if I had failed them, that would be to them that God was failing. And they would have a fear that God wouldn't be faithful either. So, fear not. Yes, God gives us a word of encouragement, but the word of fear is still there. And the third thing is, just because we get in trouble doesn't mean that we've been faithful. Elijah was called the troubler of Israel, but Elijah wasn't looking for trouble. It's just that sometimes trouble finds us, and we have to be willing sometimes to deal with some difficult times and spaces. But that doesn't give us room for vengeance. I know for me, I sometimes think the way to settle a problem is with a 2x4. That's not the way to settle the problem with a 2x4. We need to be patient and forgiving and understanding, and that's a part of it. Those are 3 lessons for us as we look at Obadiah and Elijah. We never hear of Obadiah again. There's a book called Obadiah. It's a different Obadiah, but this was the servant of God. God placed him in a place for time to accomplish the thing, and then he brought Elijah, which has another meaning, which Eli means my God, and Yah means Yahweh. Just as Obadiah, Elijah, they both end in the same word of Yah, or Yahweh is God. One says servant of God, the other says my God is Yah. Both of them were the servant, and both of them worship the right God. All right, we'll finish there, and then we'll pick up next week's in a short time. All right, Father, thank you for what you have to teach us. Help us to be faithful. Help us to to be as judging of ourselves as we would be of others. Help us to be as understanding of others as we would want others to be understanding of ourselves. Help us to not take vengeance, but to realize that vengeance is yours and you delight in mercy. You do not seek the death of any that are called sinners. So help us to be faithful too. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week.